All right, everyone. So I'm about to begin our lecture for chapter 4 in Schreyer, which is really the kind of the chapter in the classical era that's really kind of covering the vast majority outside of Islam of the cultural traditions that we're going to kind of look at in this course. And so before I do this, I want to be very clear as to what we are and what we are not. This is AP World History. We are a history course. We are not a religion course. We are a history course. And so, I'm going to be covering a lot of different belief systems and cultural traditions and religions and looking at them from like a historical angle, right? What is their impact? How did they develop? What was their relationship like with other regions in the area? And so, I want to get that very clear here because I'm really not trying to field a whole lot of nonsense complaints about what I am doing or what I am not doing. We're going to be talking about Buddhism. We're going to talk about Hinduism. We're going to talk about Christianity. We're going to talk about Judaism. We're going to talk about Chinese belief systems. And they all sort of arose at the same time. So let's go on. Okay, so when we look at this particular chapter and we kind of lay the groundwork of what's in front of us, right? What is the roadmap that we're going to be following in this particular chapter? We are looking at a number of different cultural traditions, right? And so we're saying cultural traditions or belief systems instead of the word religions, because religions doesn't apply to all that we're going to look at here, right? So we're gonna refer to them as cultural traditions. Some will be religious, some will be more secular. But let's take a look. In East Asia, particularly in China, we're seeing kind of the introduction of the big three, right? And this is actually where we're going to be focusing on the early part of the week. But we see Confucianism, right? We see Taoism, and we see legalism. Legalism was introduced in last chapter, kind of that no nonsense, law and order, harsh punishment, and strong rewards in order to kind of gather a society that was in chaos. And so these are the three belief systems that we're looking at within East Asian societies. In South Asia, more specifically India, we're looking at two major belief systems that emerged there. Number one, Hinduism. Earliest beliefs of Hinduism emerged out of the Indus River Valley and moved into kind of greater India, and still the dominant religion in the region today. But we also see in South Asia and India the emergence of Buddhism, right? Siddhartha, the Buddha. And when we look at Buddhism, what's really interesting is Buddhism is actually not that common in India today. For the most part, it was absorbed into Hinduism, and we're going to talk about that word syncretism as we go forward. And it's kind of like that $1 million word like patriarchy, right? That sticks with us. But Buddhism was largely kind of consumed or integrated into Hinduism, and moved out of India along trade routes, particularly the Silk Road, into China, Japan, Korea, as we get later in our course. When we look at the Middle East, we are looking at a lot of monotheistic religions. Going back to last chapter with Greece and Persia, right? We saw the emergence of Zoroastrianism in Persia, which John Green said was arguably the first monotheistic religion and kind of the first religion that gave rise to this notion of good versus evil, of heaven versus hell, of a god of light versus a god of darkness and Satan. And then we see kind of the influence of that had on Judaism, right? The Abrahamic religion of the Old Testament, right, or the Torah, which eventually emerged and grew into Christianity, right? We're going to talk about this later, but historically, right, Jesus of Nazareth was born Jewish, lived his entire life as a Jew, and died Jewish, right? But along the way, he gave rise to a movement, a reform movement, designed to kind of make more equal and more fair and provide, God's love to everyone. But it was a reformed Judaist or Jewish sect, right? It was a religion kind of catapulted from Jesus of Nazareth that emerged and kind of split off and formed its very own religion. And we're going to see some parallels to that from Hinduism to Buddhism and a couple others. So again, moving onward. So, when we talk about all of these belief systems or cultural traditions together, and we want to lay them like side by side, which we do in this class a lot, how do they compare, right? Like, what do they have in common? What are the big differences? And so, let's start with the similarities. Number one, they all emerged as kind of an alternative to the hunting and gathering and kind of age old human experience of polytheism. Polytheism, sometimes we're going to call it animism, but was, kind of the dominant belief system for the early part of humanity, which really celebrated, sun gods and fertility goddesses and, prayed to ancestor spirits for good harvests and, sought God's favor during wars and whatnot, right? And this was kind of a way that early humans made sense of the planet, right? And looked to various gods at various times of the year and various points in their lives to kind of help them. And so moving forward, right, they an alternative to polytheism, but they also all emerged in a way that was very clearly, from a historical perspective, designed to establish order in society. Right, whether it was vast inequalities between rich and poor, or slave and freed, as was Christianity in Judea and Palestine back during the Roman Empire, or legalism and Confucianism and Taoism during the era of warring states in China after the fall of the Shang dynasty or the Zhou dynasty. So um, they also all encouraged kind of this transformation, right? This personal growth, either moral or spiritual, but all of them, whether it was Confucius in pushing us towards kind of greater recognition of a filial piety and our honor, bringing honor to our families and listening to those above us in relationships, or in Buddhism, right, seeking nirvana and kind of the reunion of our soul and freeing us from suffering, or Christianity, right, which was pushing us to be better and be more, love thy neighbor as thyself, right, in order to grow and to experience life and humanity at a greater level. And all of these belief systems and cultural traditions did that. And if we really zoom out and we look at them from an extremely high macro level, we would also say that they all had enormous impact on some of the world's dominant cultures for thousands of years. Right? When we look at the world today, a lot of these religions are still, or not religions, these cultural traditions are still, in play, either in open practice or strong cultural influence. Right? We see Buddhism in East and Southeast Asia. We see Christianity, right, and is the largest religion in the world. We see Judaism is still around, Hinduism, which is a dominant religion in the Indian subcontinent, a nation of over 1 billion people, right, and then we see Islam, which grew out of Judaism and Christianity and became the third Abrahamic religion. And so we And then if we kind of continue forward, when we start looking at some of the differences that separated them, if we say, these are four basic high level similarities that they all have in common, right? Our thesis statement would be balanced by some pretty clear differences, right? Number one, when we look at some of these cultural traditions, some of them are clearly more secular than others. Now, the word secular, if we were in person, I would give you my lesson on what secular and non secular is, but at its heart, we'll say this: Atlas is a secular school. St. Mary's Catholic School is not a secular school, right? The word secular means non-religious. So if we say Atlas is a secular school, Atlas is a non-religious school, right? And so when we look at the Chinese belief systems or cultural traditions, and particularly the Greek cultural traditions of Greek rationalism, what we see is belief systems or cultural traditions that are far, they're not rooted in a heaven, they're not rooted in gods, they're not rooted in anything other than this world right in front of us. But when we look at the Middle Eastern and the Indian and the Middle Eastern, South Asian traditions, we see the religious traditions that are legitimately religious, right? That have an afterlife, that have a god or gods, have pretty clear like religious overtones, far more than the secular nature of like Confucianism or legalism. So now when we look at from like a historical perspective, and we have sociologists or anthropologists and historians kind of looking at this question, I'm going to give you two different interpretations. One, the purely historical, secular interpretation, and then I will balance it out there for those of you who are looking for find ways of keeping your personal faith in not in conflict with a secular read. Let's take a look at why so many emerged at the same time, right? And so um, if we look at it from the secular angle, what historians and anthropologists would see is that around about 300 500 BCE, we saw major changes in the human experience, right? We saw kind of the birth of empires and the growing of cities and kind of the changing of the human experience. And these major social changes ended up creating what happens every time there's major social change, which is periods of intense warfare and bloodshed. We also saw technology improve, where we started having iron weapons, which were much more efficient at killing people. And so, war became deadlier and civilization is booming, and people kind of all around the world this is happening in East Asia and South Asia and the Middle East. And people are looking at that and saying, God, everything is changing so fast. How do we make sense of it all? And so again, like as we see this, we also start seeing that people are coming in contact with far away people. Trade routes are opening up, and the Road is getting started, and trade along the Indian Ocean pathways. And what we do know is that religion moves along trade routes and kind of inspires in interactions pretty frequently. And so all of these things kind of led to this seeking of order, this way to explain the universe, a way of providing meaning to what is a very confusing and very unsettling life, right? And so, again, all of these things changed. And so, from an anthropologist secular perspective, you'd say, well, people have sought out and created and codified a religious system that kind of provided order into the chaos and promoted people to be better and calmer and more productive and all the things that would have been threatened. Now, the more religious interpretation, which I offer not from a historical angle, but merely as a way to kind of justify, or not justify, but align what I'm saying with perhaps your personal beliefs, is you might look at it and say, well, when all this was happening to humans, that is when God chose to reveal themselves to humanity, right? That in time of great need. Um, but again, we're a history class, and so let's focus on the secular historical part here. So, moving kind of further on, let's specifically kind of zero in on the Chinese cultural traditions. And so, we need to place them in context, right? The emergence of Confucianism, the emergence of Taoism, the emergence of legalism. How did Chinese history lead to cultural developments? And so what we see on this map right here is kind of this map representing China after the Zhou dynasty. It was the Shang dynasty, and then the Zhou dynasty. And what happened after the Zhou dynasty was the kind of the imperial order of China kind of disintegrated, right? And China, as ruled by one empire, right, or dynasty, disintegrated. And what rose was a series of seven kind of mini Chinese states, right? The Qin, the Zhao, the Wei, the Han, the Chu, the Qi, the Yan, and all of these smaller, like Chinese states, formed kind of a series of competing warring kingdoms. This was known as the Warring States period, right? When you had a lot of different players trying to be the new imperial dynasty. And so when we look at this, we know that by 500 BCE, China had already lived as an empire longer than any other place in the world, right? The Shang dynasty emerged around 3000 BCE. That's about 2,500 years by this point, which is, again, we think that doesn't sound that long, but think it's 2020 today. 2,500 years ago was before the rise of Jesus and in Christianity and, Western Europe and all that. And so China by 500 BC had lived as an empire ruled under singular dynasties for a long time. And these unified Chinese experience had really become kind of the norm for people. The mandate of heaven had been firmly established in people's cultural beliefs, right? And the mandate of heaven is clearly that the ruler is chosen by God or by the heavens to rule so long as good things are happening